goes fast like ocean waves. The anthems thrill the fluid veins. Choirs lift us high, then crash. Triumphant cries through sacred chains. Beneath the lights we conquer. Feel the dreams are cloud of strife. Heroes born from sweat and grit. Forever chance through endless life. We are the raging hearts in stadiums, pulse alive. Under neon glare defiant, this fever we thrive.
Okay, guys, the first time on this podcast, I am going to be discussing cricket, Australia's national sport. Well, supposedly. Look, I am a big fan of cricket as a sport. I don't have much time for where cricket has gone in 2024, for the last 10 years, really. I do love the sport. It's usually our favourite pastime when the rugby league seasons are over, rugby league's finished, AFL's finished. You then look forward to the cricket, particularly the Test series, whoever the international teams that come out, and then the one-day series, and that leads into the Australian Open, and then we're right back into the rugby league again. That's normal. That's normally how things go in Australia. We have the second Test coming up, Australia versus India, probably the biggest rival on the planet. It starts tomorrow. It's in Adelaide, and I don't think anyone cares. I've seen nothing. No media outlets are really talking about it. It's very, very under the radar. Compared to what it was 15, 20 years ago, the excitement would be fever pitch. Look, at the end of the day, good luck to the Indians. The first Test was an absolute debacle. The fact that India were bowled out for 150 in the first innings still went on to win by 287 runs. What on earth is going on with Australian Test cricket? Again, one of our favourite pastimes. If you're an Australian and you love sport, usually you just love cricket. It goes without saying. I don't feel that anymore. What is it? For mine, I blame 2020 cricket. I've never really caught on to the concept. You can call me a traditionalist. Oh, I love Test match cricket, big deal. I don't call myself a traditionalist. That's the game. The short format is the 50-over game. And for the longest time, it was wonderful. The World Cups, the 50-over format, the World Cups were a wonderful event. Terrific spectacle. I'm 40, so my first memories of the World Cup probably go back to 1996. I was a little bit young in 1992. But 1996 in Sri Lanka, 1999, a fabulous event. 2003 was fantastic. And all the World Cups leading up until probably the last two or three, were all memorable. But in that time, in the last 3 or 4 World Cups, 2020 cricket has inevitably taken over as the preference for the short format. Look, here's the thing about 2020 cricket. When it started, it was a bit of hit and giggle. It was fun. The first time we ever saw it was Australia. I believe it was against Pakistan at the MCG. It was David Warner announcing himself on the international stage. No one knew who David Warner was unless you watched the Sheffield Shield cricket. And it was great. You had Matthew Hayden, Adam Gilchrist. You had 10 players there with zero accountability, 20 overs, just go for your life champ. I mean, it was great to watch. It was a bit of fun. I didn't anticipate the size, or I didn't anticipate the explosion that 2020 cricket would have on the globe. And with all due respect, I do blame India. I'm not trying to have a go at them. I just blame India. And I still to this day believe that the reason why India embraced 2020 cricket so much, they saw it as an avenue where they could finally topple the Australian juggernaut. Because Australia had just taken ownership of Test match and international cricket and had it for the longest time. Now, international cricket in the late 80s, early 90s, into the early millennia, into the mid-millennia, was absolutely brilliant. Brilliant. Every single nation was competitive. Australia just happened to be at the top of the tree because they were just so good. But my goodness, you can go through the teams from the late 80s to early 90s, the West Indian teams, the Pakistan teams, even the teams that were lower ranked. England and New Zealand were sort of 6th, 7th, hovering around that area. Much better teams then than they are today. The English team back then would smoke today's English team. The New Zealand team back then would smoke today's New Zealand team. And New Zealand cricket has had a bit of a renaissance the last 5-6 years. They've been really good, but that New Zealand team was fantastic. It would have tore shreds off the current New Zealand team. South Africa, absolutely brilliant. India were brilliant. Pakistan were the one-day world champions. Then you had the emergence of the Sri Lankan team in the mid-90s. The Sri Lankan teams were crazy good. And the Australians were just top of the tree. But when 2020 cricket came in, it was hit and giggle. It was supposed to be a bit of fun. And then, I'm not sure what year it was, but at some point, 2020 became civilized. It became civilized. It was no longer hit and giggle. It started to become strategized. Coaches were coming in trying to specialize in how to actively strategize their way through a 2020 contest. And at that time, that's when cricket started to die. And I think it's just dying a slow death now as a result. I really do. The biggest thing that I noticed, and anyone who's ever played cricket, and I played cricket for many years, the scariest thing to deal with in cricket is an express pace bowler. But the one thing about an express bowler is if you decide to just go all out attack on an express bowler, you decide to just swing the bat, no accountability, throw away your wicket, your wicket's irrelevant, you get a bit of a nick. That ball's travelling over the fence. Now, in Test match cricket, and particularly the 50-over format and the one-day cricket, you don't want to throw your wicket away. As a batsman, you need to preserve your wicket at all costs. So going after an express bowler is not the way to go about it. You've got to pick your moments, you've got to pick your positions, you've got to attack when the ball's there to play. But when they're on target, particularly someone like Glenn McGrath was around about 135, but he was just on a penny every single time. He was so hard to get away. You had to pick your moments. You didn't want to throw your wicket away. You get to the 2020 format, and it's like, well, you've got no accountability. Who cares if you get out? Just go out, swing the bat, and if you get out, doesn't matter. We've got 20 overs. We've got 10 wickets. We can average losing a wicket every second over, and we can still have 9 wickets down by the time we finish the inning. Don't worry about it. Swing the bat. Okay. So what happens is the express bowlers became, if anything, it was the opposite of an asset. They became a liability because you're running it at 150 kilometres an hour. Sometimes you're hitting the 160. Sean Tate, he was an elite bowler when 2020 started. All of a sudden, 2020 came in and Sean Tate, well, where did he go? Because bowlers are running in at 160 kilometres an hour. If you're just throwing the bat at the ball, all you need is a nick. So when I talk about coaches coming in and strategizing the 2020 format, it became about lack of pace. Take the speed off the ball. Make the batsman generate the speed. Make the batsman generate their own pace. So all of a sudden, you've got these bowlers coming in that are just rolling their shoulders over 110, 115 kilometres an hour, if that. Batsmen forced to generate their own pace off the wicket, making it much harder to hit boundaries, much, much harder to hit sixes. And all of a sudden, you've got opening bowlers that are coming in as spin bowlers. People coming in, opening bowling, first over of the innings. You've got people just left arm orthodox. Ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. It's just not entertaining for me. But trying to restrict it in the 2020 format means taking the pace off the ball, right? So when there's power plays, so everyone's in the inner circle, so there's no one on the boundary, you want to bring your slow bowlers on. It's supposed to be the other way around. That's supposed to be the most exciting part of the game. Those first 4 or 5 overs, that's what you watch the game for. How many times you watch the Boxing Day Test match? You're up at 6 in the morning, you're so excited. And you're just waiting for that first over. And you've got Brett Lee just steaming in. He's going to be throwing him down at 155, pushing 160 Ks. You know, if it's not him and it was Shai Bakhtar. If it wasn't Shai Bakhtar, you can go back to Alan Donald or Curtly Ambrose. You can go back to Devon Malcolm. I mean, it doesn't really matter. Shane Bond for New Zealand. Unbelievable speeds. That was what made cricket exciting. And now, you know, you get the 2020 formats and they're just rolling their arms over. Now, at the beginning when 2020 became so dominant, there were 2020 players and there were test match players. But because all the money went into the 2020, the necessity to play or want to even represent your country at test match level, it became an afterthought. So what's happening now is you've got this very dangerous amalgamation where 2020 players are now becoming your test players. And they're not set up for test match cricket. Case in point, the first test. India 150 and still won the test match by almost 300 runs. What are Australia doing? And when you watch them, there's no one in there looking to say, I'm going to bat 2 days. I'm going to bat 2 days. I'm going to look at a double century, maybe more. If it takes me 400 or 500 balls to get there, I need to settle this innings. No, it's just not happening anymore. They're not set up for that because they're thinking about 2020 has completely changed the fabric of cricket. A test match cricket game, a 5-day test match, when it's tight and it's tense, is one of the most amazing things you watch. Now, in America and other parts of the world, they don't understand how can you watch one game for 5 days. When you have a game, I'll give you a great example. West Indies, Australia, I think it was 1999, third test. Right now, West Indies and Australia have had a plethora of amazing test matches. But this one really, really stood out to me because it was getting played in the West Indies. It was 1-1 in the test series. It was the third test match. Australia, good first innings. West Indies, not too bad. Australia came out. They set West Indies a target of about 310 for victory. Might have been 308, something around that. At the time, it was a world record attempt. By the time you got to the last few overs of the day, you've had all 5 days wondering who's going to win this test match. You get to the last few overs, the possibilities were Australia were going to win, West Indies were going to win, or it was going to be a draw. The 3 outcomes that were possible were still alive after 4 3/4 days. Incredibly tense. And Brian Lara, my favourite all-time player, he got 153 in that second inning to win the test match. But the way it shaped up, you talk about nerves. And I remember waking up in the morning, having to go to school, and I said to my father, can I please go to school late today? I don't want to miss this. I've been up since 5 o'clock this morning. I don't want to miss this. And he's like, son, don't worry about it. I'm going to watch it with you. And I'll drop you off afterwards. And whatever the principal says, I don't care. It was that enthralling. You don't get that these days. But it was that enthralling. And it got to a point where the West Indies were 8 down. They needed about 60 or 70 runs still to go. It would look like Australia were going to win. You had Brian Lara there, which was a problem. You had Curtly Ambrose in there, and the only one coming up was Courtney Walsh. They had about 60 or 70 to come. Now, Curtly Ambrose did a wonderful job. He only got 12 runs, but he hung in there for about 45, 50 deliveries, and it allowed Brian Lara, one, to get his century, and then to start to really tick over that scoreboard to try to chop down these runs. And then about 3 overs before the end, Curtly Ambrose nicks one to slip. Jason Gillespie gets him. And then it was the first ball of the over. Courtney Walsh comes out. So now you're in a scenario where the West Indies needed about 8 runs to win. I think they were 9 for 300 at the time. They needed about 8 runs to win, but they were 9 for 300. And here comes Courtney Walsh trying to, you know what? I think it was closer. It was closer. I remember now it was 6 runs to win. So it was 9 for 302. And Courtney Walsh comes in and he had 5 balls to face. And Jason Gillespie, I remember he runs in, he bowls a ball, and Courtney Walsh leaves it, goes through to the keeper. The crowd's celebrating, and then Jason Gillespie, they look up, it's a no ball. So the crowd then starts to cheer because another run has been chopped off the total, but there's an extra ball that Courtney Walsh has to face. This was the tension that you had. I mean, it was incredibly tense. Anyway, Courtney Walsh, somehow, someway, he survives. Glenn McGrath comes in, another over. They survive that one. Jason Gillespie comes back out. At that point, Brian Lara had finally got himself back on strike. He was on 149. As if the drama wasn't enough, Brian Lara was on 149 runs, and they needed 1 run for victory. At that point, it was a tie. That's all Australia could do. They had to now get the last wicket. The problem is Courtney Walsh at the non-strikers end. Brian Lara was on strike. 149. At that point, it looked like West Indies were going to win. Jason Gillespie bowls it a little bit wide of the crease, which is fair enough because you've got to attack. You've got to look for an edge. You've got to look for a nick. What happens? Brian Lara just smokes to the boundary. They ended up winning. He hit a 4. He goes 153 not out. They won by 1 wicket. And he got his 150 on that last run. Incredibly tense. The day was coming to an end very, very soon. That is the beauty of Test match cricket. It just doesn't happen anymore. We do not get these contests anymore. It's really, really sad. I talk about Brian Lara because the amount of times that man got over 200 and even past 300 on some occasions, the amount of concentration it needs to get to that point is just second to none. And that's why, for mine, he's the greatest I've ever seen. I'm not saying he's better than Don Bradman, so everyone calm down, but he's the best that I've ever seen, right? The first time I was introduced to Test match cricket, my uncle and my auntie took me to the SCG in 1992, Australia playing the West Indies, and my uncle used to go for the West Indies, which is really unusual because we're Australian through and through. But that's the impact West Indies cricket had on the world, that even if you weren't a West Indian, sometimes you went for them. It didn't even matter. They were so good to watch. The Calypso Kings were so good to watch. So he went for the West Indies and he took me. That was my first ever experience, and we sat right on the boundary. And I remember Australia were bowling first. Desmond Haynes gets out for about 4 runs, or they were 1 for 4. I don't know. He might have had a duck. I'm not too sure. And I remember my uncle cheering. And I looked up. I was 7 years old. I was a bit confused because I'm like, why are you cheering? I thought you went for the West Indies. And he just looks at me, and I never forget him just saying because of who's coming in. I said, okay, fair enough. And this kid starts walking to the crease. He looked like nothing. Very, very thin, very, very short, and he's walking past the likes of Merv Hughes and Whitney and McDermott, and these guys were monstering. I said to my uncle, this kid, what's this kid going to do? And he just said, well, if he doesn't get out early, you watch him go. Anyway, this kid was Brian Lara. Next thing I know, I was sitting on the boundary. The amount of times I caught the ball out of the gully, no ropes back then, you had to hit the fence. The amount of times I caught the ball out of the gully, and it just felt like all I remember is Brian Lara flashing up 50, 100, 150. We went back the next day, 200, 250. And I just remember that vision. I was a bit young, so I can only remember parts. But the screen and Brian Lara continually flashing his bat. I'm like, what is going on with this kid? They just can't get him out. He eventually got out for 277, and in the famous words of Shane Warne, because it was run out, by the way, that was the only way we were going to get him. He'd still be batting today. I'll never forget Shane Warne said that. They just could not get him out. He ended up getting run out, but I was hooked for life at that point. And I was hooked on the West Indies because of Brian Lara. Now, obviously, I'm back on the Australian train now because Brian Lara has since retired, but I was addicted to that man. He was absolutely brilliant. And some of the things he did on that field were absolutely magical. You can have your Tendulkars, you can have anyone you want. For mine, Lara was the best. And you're never going to change my mind. You can make arguments, but you're never going to change my mind. The point that I'm trying to make is, if you look at who the best batsman is today, I would probably say Virat Kohli would have that title, and that's fine. I've got no issues with Virat Kohli. But you have to have a question mark about the bowling attacks that he's coming up against. Particularly since 2020 has come in, it's formulated this bowling style where our opening bowlers are running in 120, 125. 130 is a good effort for some of our fast bowlers, our elite fast bowlers. There's just no one express anymore. There's no one that's pumping fear into the batsman. Like, with all due respect to Virat Kohli, if you go back to India's in the late 90s and the mid 2000s, that batting attack they had, you've got Virender Sehwag, Sachin Tendulkar, who else was there? Rahul Dravid, Ganguly, VVS Laxman. I want to be respectful here. Where does Kohli sit in that batting lineup? Now, out of those ones, Ganguly was the captain. Rahul Dravid was one of the greatest batsmen ever. Sachin Tendulkar is arguably the greatest batsman ever. And Virender Sehwag is the most destructive opener you've ever seen. VVS Laxman, maybe he makes way. But VVS Laxman, what a batsman he was. I mean, VVS Laxman, you're talking about a guy here who scored, I think it was 281 against Australia. Let me put this one for you. Australia, at the peak of their powers, they had won 16 test matches in a row. They go to India, put on a big score first innings. They then bowl India out. India didn't even make the follow-on. Australia put them back in. And VVS Laxman, and I remember he was with Rahul Dravid. I think they put on like almost 500 runs together. But VVS Laxman scored about 281 runs. He was so good that not only they didn't enforce the follow-on, they had to bat again. They ended up beating Australia in that test match. An Australian side that at that point had the world record of 16 consecutive test wins. And he beat them. You're talking about McGrath, Gillespie, Brett Lee, Shane Warne, and VVS Laxman got 281. You reckon Virat Kohli could have got 281 against that bowling attack? Look, I don't know. But if he's the one who makes way, I couldn't see anyone else. So I want to be respectful. If Virat Kohli, who by the way has more Twitter followers than LeBron James, so you're talking about a mega star of sport. I'm going for Australia, obviously, in these Test match series. But when Virat Kohli's on, I want to see him bat. I want to see him get centuries. I don't really want to see him get out for a duck. Otherwise, what am I watching? It's hard enough to watch it anyway without seeing Virat Kohli go out for a low score. But where does Virat Kohli sit in that lineup? Hit me up at mike@globalsportfanatics.com or any of my socials. Let me know what you think. Where does Virat Kohli sit in the great batsmen of all time? Because with all due respect to Virat, if you put Brian Lara against some of these shoulder rollers that are coming in, opening the bowling at 125 Ks, Brian Lara would have been insulted by that. He would have taken that bowling attack to school. It would have been embarrassing. Sachin Tendulkar would have laughed at that. The Australian batsman, Ricky Ponting, what would Ricky Ponting have done to opening bowlers that were running in 120, 125 Ks? You can't all be Glenn McGrath. Glenn McGrath was just an absolute freak of nature. Besides him, you can't go at that speed against these batsmen. So I have to have a question mark on Virat Kohli's greatness because I don't have much time for the bowling attacks that he's been coming up with, to be honest, throughout just about his whole career. I mean, you want to talk about what international cricket was like in the 90s into the millennium. Any team, you go to South Africa, you've got Alan Donald and Sean Pollock. You go to, forget Australia. Australia have always had elite, Glenn McGrath. You can have Kasperowitz, you can have Jason Gillespie, you can have Brett Lee, you can have Shane Warne. Stuart McGill, probably the second greatest leg spinner of all time, couldn't even get in the side when Shane Warne was at his peak. That's how good Australia were going. The West Indies with Curtly Ambrose and Courtney Walsh and Ian Bishop and the like. Pakistan, if you go back to the early 90s, Waqar Younis, Wasim Akram. This is after Imran Khan. And then you had Mushtaq Ahmed, and then later on you had Saqlain Mushtaq. I mean, some great bowlers. Even sides that you never talk about. Zimbabwe were a good team back then. I mean, Zimbabwe, you had Heath Streak and Andy Flower, and Alonga came in, the first black player to ever play for Zimbabwe. These were great teams, great rivalries. Sri Lanka in the mid-90s, Ranatunga and Jayasuriya and Kaluwitharinen and Chaminda Vas and Mutai Muralitharan, and then later on you had Sangakkara and Jayawardena. They just had some magnificent players. So my question is this: what on earth has happened to our great players? Where have they all gone? Where have our great test match players gone? I don't know. I don't see them. I didn't see anything in the first test. Australia, if you can't find it watching Australia play India, where are you going to find them? I'm not having a go at all the international players around. There are good ones. England's got some good players. I get that. And South Africa have got some good players. New Zealand's got some good players. But where are these great players? I've just rattled off all these names. Where are they? When India came here, like Bumrah. I think Bumrah's a very good bowler. The most disgusting action I've ever seen. I don't know what's going on, but in a way it's kind of worked. It's probably good that no one has fixed his action. But where does Bumrah sit in the great bowlers of all time? Now, India have never been known for their great express fast bowlers. So Bumrah, you could argue, is probably one of their better ones. That's fine. But you're going to put Bumrah in the same category as McGrath, Brett Lee, Shoaib Akhtar, Wasim Akram, Waqar Younis, Courtney Walsh, Curtly Ambrose, Alan Donald, Sean Pollock, Dale Steyn, even from South Africa. I mean, you're going to put Bumrah in that category? It's a big call. Forget about going to the 80s with Sir Richard Hadley and Dennis Lilly and Jeff Thompson and into the 70s, etc. Michael Holding, Andy Roberts, Joel Garner, Malcolm Marshall. What a bowling lineup that was. But at the end of the day, where does Bumrah sit in that? And he's probably, in fact, I'll call it, I think he's probably the best fast bowler in the world right now. I think most of you would agree. If Bumrah is the best fast bowler in the world in 2024, and look at the names I've just rattled off, where on earth does cricket in 2024 sit in the pantheon of great eras? Me personally, I think we are currently at its absolute lowest ebb. I've never seen test match cricket lower than what it currently is. The demise of West Indian cricket is one of the saddest things in international sport. But I've got to be honest, I think it all started with 2020. It changed the fabric of the game. It changed the reason why people wanted to play the game. The money went to the wrong area. It should have gone to test matches. It went to 2020. I understand why it went to 2020, because you get the young kids in. You can watch a game within 4 hours. It's all done and dusted. I understand all that. But it's not cricket. The old saying, when something goes wrong, it's not cricket. That's the saying we have in Australia. When something bad happens at work, they say it's not cricket. Well, this is the one time where it's actually relevant to the game. 2020 cricket is not cricket. And the fact that it is the biggest money spinner is an absolute travesty to the game that I loved. Hope you enjoyed my content on the cricket for the first time on my podcast. Let me know, is cricket dying a slow and painful death, or is it about to be resurrected? Hit me up at mike@globalsportfanatics.com or any of my socials. Cheers.
Cold wind, biting whispers.